Hello, and thank you very much for tuning in to the podcast series by the New Silk Road Project. I'm your host today, Charles Stevens, the founder of the New Silk Road Project. This series is dedicated to understanding and raising awareness of one of the most important development strategies of the 21st century, China's Belt and Road Initiative. The centerpiece of the New Silk Road Project, an initiative supported by Jeep, CSIS, Magellan Capital, the University of St Andrews and Shira, was to travel the course of the Silk Road economic belt from London to Yiwu in eastern China, interviewing the key actors and academics along its course. We will have to apologise in advance for some of the tangential moments in this podcast series, and also the variable quality of audio footage. We do hope this series sheds important light into China's growing global presence and the significant changes taking place across Eurasia. Before we interviewed Plamen Tonchev, head of the Asia unit at the Institute of Economic Relations in Athens, Greece, we went on a tour visit of the port of Piraeus with him. He provided insight into the way in which Piraeus is being used as an entry point into the wider European market, the changing perceptions of the Chinese in Greece, and the wider investment into an economy which has struggled with political, fiscal, and economic uncertainty in recent years.
I suppose we started working on BRI back in 2014, a year after it was announced, at the Asia unit of the Institute of International Economic Relations here in Athens, Greece. We decided to join the European think tank network on China, ETNC, and in fact since then we've worked intensively on BRI. We've contributed to 3 annual reports so far, all of them related to BRI one way or another, and we are doing it again, working on the 4th annual report to come out later this year.
What do you think are COSCO's motives for the purchase of the port of Piraeus?
I think it's quite clear that the Piraeus mega project, because it is a very ambitious project, relates to BRI. It is quite clear and nobody's hiding it, and COSCO are being very outspoken about it, that this project relates to the transportation of commodities into Central and Western Europe, and possibly about the transportation of European products back to the Mediterranean and then back to East Asia, possibly China.
And you don't think there's any other motives behind it?
Well, BRI is a very ambitious, large-scale project, and we're still trying to gauge the overall rationale behind it. I think it cannot be economic only. I think that there are political motives behind it, which is understandable and reasonable. Exactly what these political ambitions could be is a matter of a very long discussion.
How do you think COSCO's purchase of Piraeus will affect other Mediterranean ports?
You see, COSCO has been purchasing other Mediterranean ports as well. It's been purchasing stock and has been taking over other Mediterranean ports in Italy, Spain, even France, and further north, Belgium, the Netherlands, and even Germany. In what way Piraeus could affect their projects in other European ports? There's been talk about Piraeus being a pilot project. They may be testing some techniques in terms of, dealing with governments and local stakeholders, in terms of, the finance provided, in terms of dealing with EU rules and regulations, and the EU does have its own rules and regulations when it comes to competition, and COSCO have witnessed this because they've had to lose some of their initial privileges after they lost some legal battles against the EU institutions. But in any case, it is an important project for COSCO and China because they are learning a lot of things that they could possibly use elsewhere in Europe.
And what do you think the significance of the north-south transport corridor from Piraeus to Central and Eastern Europe is for both Greece and China?
It is certainly important for China for several reasons. First of all, they can save a lot of money because when this transport corridor starts working properly, they can save at least 8 days, which would otherwise be needed for their ships to travel around Europe to reach Rotterdam or Hamburg. Secondly, it is important for the Chinese for political reasons, because in dealing with Greece and the Western Balkans, again, they're testing their political clout and their techniques in dealing with at least 2 types of countries: EU member states and countries outside the EU. So I think that they're making the best of this. They are learning, and they are fast learners. And while the transport corridor is far from being finished, it is being built for sure.
So they haven't invested per se into petrochemicals or into media or into other areas apart from those sectors that you highlighted.
If you look at Chinese investment in other parts of Europe, they have invested a lot in the media sector in, say, the Czech Republic and other European countries. Petrochemicals, yes, they've invested in refineries in, say, Romania and again other European countries. Here in Greece, they've invested mostly in these 3 sectors that you mentioned. It's transport, it's energy and telecoms. And these sectors seem to be closely related to BRI. And again, they're not hiding it. But apart from these 3 sectors, the Chinese are showing their increasing interest in 2 more sectors, which would be tourism and real estate. They do not seem to relate directly to BRI, but they are of growing importance to both the Chinese and Greece.
And on the discussion of real estate, of course, it's important both to individual Chinese investors and corporations in London. What sort of investments have they made into Greece?
According to research we made and published last December, which is 6 months back, there were about 800 Chinese citizens, individuals, buying property, real estate in Greece, and the aggregate value of their investment amounts to about $500 million, which is not negligible. And in fact, there are very many indications that the number and the worth of their investment in Greek real estate will be growing.
And how has increased Chinese investment impacted Sino-Greek relations?
We argue very strongly, in very strong terms, that there's a very visible impact on Sino-Greek relations for reasons which may not be easy to understand. While Chinese investment in Greece is not that remarkable, we calculate it to be in the range of 1.5 to 2 billion, and Greece needs a lot more investment. In fact, Greece needs foreign investment in the range of more than 150 billion euros. We argue in our report that while Chinese investment is not that big, you can see several indications of Greece's foreign policy being affected by China's clout. Let me remind you that back in 2016, Greece actually supported China on the South China Sea dispute and ran counter the EU position on this issue. And then in 2017, last year, Greece supported China on yet another controversial issue when the EU decided to issue its annual statement on the state of human rights in China. Greece vetoed that, raising very many eyebrows and making a lot of people to ask themselves what is happening in Greece. Is Greece being dominated by China, or what?
And can as you touched on earlier, can Greece tangibly benefit in the long run from Chinese investment?
I would say yes, and it's a definitive yes. But I must immediately add that if Greece needs something like 150 billion euros over the next 5 years, and Greece has only got 1.5 to 2 billion euros from China to date, you can immediately understand that Chinese investment in Greece is actually a tiny little fraction of what Greece needs.
And how has that grown since the initial investment?
Well, it's been growing slowly, I would say. COSCO is moving on with some of what is called the mandatory investment in the Piraeus port in the range of 300 million euros, which is again necessary, but only a tiny little fraction of what Greece's economy needs. So I would say that, again, this is not really impressive.
And as we heard about earlier, improper assessments into Chinese investment is something that's a problem not just in Greece, but also the wider Balkan and Central Asian area. What do you think can be done to address this?
Well, it's a rather technical question that might be of interest to accountants. And I'm not sure that your listeners or spectators will be interested in such a technical issue. But let me very briefly tell you this. All these definitions of FDI will have to be reviewed, and they are reviewed anyway. The OECD has already produced its 4th edition of FDI definitions. It is clear that in this case, foreign investors like COSCO or State Grid in Greece will have to have their real cash investment properly reflected. OECD definitions of FDI seem to be very restrictive. They will have to be broadened and certainly reviewed.
There seems to be a paradoxical relationship between China's need for the EU to provide stability, but at the same time Chinese investment is undermining that very stability it needs. How can these tensions continue to coexist?
If you talk to Chinese investors and also Chinese decision makers, they will hint at the fact that they are learning things about Europe. I would say that on the other side of the line, Europeans are learning things about the Chinese way of doing business. It's a learning curve for both sides.
And can you discuss a bit more about these things that you mentioned?
Well, for instance, the Chinese are learning about EU rules and regulations. To give you an obvious example, one of their flagship projects has been the high-speed railway between Belgrade and Budapest, Hungary, which is part of this transport corridor we were talking about previously. Well, initially the contract signed by the Hungarian government and the Chinese construction company was never really published, and there was a lack of transparency about this contract. So the EU institutions, the European Commission in this case, came down very harshly on both Hungary and the Chinese contractor, and the contract was cancelled. It has now been republished on a lot more transparent terms. How are the Europeans learning things about the Chinese side? I think Europeans are slowly but steadily beginning to understand where the Chinese are coming from. Not just in terms of geography, but also in terms of their mentality, mindset, and ambitions. And I think I can fairly confidently say that there's a lot to learn about the Chinese, and there's a lot of misunderstanding between both sides, Europe and China.
Thank you. And is increasing visibility of Chinese investments in both Piraeus and the wider Greek area affecting perceptions of the Chinese amongst the political community, the academic community like yourself, and also the wider public?
I'm glad that you're asking me this question because at this very moment we are carrying out a research into China's image in Greece. And I'm glad to tell you that this report will be finalized and published possibly next September. And it is a fascinating project. Judging from some early findings that we already have at our disposal, I can tell you that there's a lot of misunderstanding, or there's clearly a lack of understanding about China. There's lack of awareness about China, at least here in Greece. Secondly, there are very many misconceptions about China. What we are finding out, and it's fascinating in its controversial nature, is that on the one hand, Greek citizens understand that China is still developing in many ways. They understand that there are very many challenges in terms of their environment or the protection of human rights. And then on the other hand, Greek citizens think of China really very highly. Interestingly, China is the most popular, or rather, the popularity of China is the highest in Greece compared to all the other EU member states. So that's a bit controversial and not very easy to explain. It's a mixed picture. But I would add to that over the last decade or so, because of Greece's fiscal and economic and political crisis, there's a lot of disenchantment with the EU. Therefore, Greek citizens have instinctively been looking for an alternative or alternatives. And China is definitely being seen as one of those possible alternatives.
And drilling down a little bit into how these perceptions differ, perhaps among the political elites and maybe journalists or academics, has your research addressed some of the differences between these different communities?
If you look at the political level, I would say that the current government is definitely very much in support of China. And this is precisely because there's been this tension between Greece and international creditors. And the current government has been under pressure. It has not been all too happy to implement the ongoing bailout agreement, which is why it has been at loggerheads with EU institutions on a number of occasions. And it's this current government which has made some impressive overtures to China over the last 2 years. At lower levels, at the level of citizens, the general public, I would say that it's not enthusiasm, but a lack of awareness and knowledge. It's a more prominent trend. At the level of the academia and the media, I would say that there's growing interest in China, but still in an insufficient degree of understanding of what China stands for.
And of course, part of the question is obvious, but are you happy to discuss maybe less obvious ways in which EU influence and investment differs from that of Chinese?
Well, that's a very interesting question, but that calls for a very long answer. Let me tell you this. Again, I can only quote a study published last December. While Greece is a member of the EU, and one would have expected a lot of EU investment in Greece, this is not really the case. The main reason for that being that Greece is not really inviting an investment. In fact, there's a huge degree of red tape, and I would say an anti-investment culture in Greece. I wouldn't blame this on the EU. On the other hand, it is also true that the EU has been going through its own financial crisis, and there has been no surplus of European investors eager to invest in Greece. And this is where the Chinese stepped in. Back in 2008 and then in 2016, when then signed 2 contracts with the Greek government on Piraeus. And again in 2016 there was yet another investment project by State Grid, China's State Grid, in what we call the independent transmission operator, power transmission operator in Greece. And China's State Grid bought a 24% stake in it. Again, it is on the one hand the lack of European investors and the lack of real attractiveness of Greece's economy, and on the other hand the Chinese have been very assertive, even aggressive, in aggressively looking for investment opportunities. Why in Greece? For the reasons we discussed beforehand.
And what do you think is the single greatest challenge to BRI over the next 5 years?
I think that the Chinese investment, the level of Chinese investment and the volume of Chinese investment in Greece will be growing. I don't think the Chinese will be looking for something a lot more than what we already discussed. An entry point to Europe's larger market. The real challenge for Greece will be to make the best of Chinese investment. I would say that what Greece needs is a lot more, shall I say, well thought out strategy. It seems that China does have a very well thought out strategy. One may not like it, but it's a strategy and it's there. The problem with Greece is it doesn't seem to know what Greece wants. Consecutive Greek governments, not just the current one, but previous ones, have not really done their homework well. In fact, in our study on Chinese investment, we speak of a strategy and a half. It's clear that China has a strategy and Greece's strategy is half-baked at least.
So, in answer to your question, what the single greatest challenge to BRI is, it would be...
For Greece, the biggest challenge would be to do its homework, to clarify its strategy, to make out what Greece actually wants to get out of China's Chinese investment and its increasingly close relationship with China.
And if you were going to summarise the Belt and Road Initiative in one word, what is that word to you?
Yet to be fully understood what it's about. It is very ambitious, it is large scale, it is definitely expected to change the world in very many ways. But I think that on this side of the line, in Europe and in Greece in particular, we should set some terms that should be fully understood by China. We need to do our homework as well. We definitely have to. But we will have to set some terms to China so that there's the maximum level of clarity in our bilateral relationship.
And if I can push you for just one word on how you would sum up the Belt and Road Initiative, what is that word to you?
More than meets the eye.